What if everything you thought you knew about a legendary Hollywood family was wrong? What if the smiling red carpet photos, the long marriage, the awards, the charitable speeches were only the surface layer of something far darker? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And what if the most horrifying detail wasn't how they died, but who was standing closest when it happened? Because one minute, the Rainers were Hollywood royalty, and the next, their home became a crime scene. No warning, no public scandal, no desperate 911 call broadcast on the evening news. Just silence, then sirens, then a revelation so disturbing that even veteran detectives reportedly struggled to speak it out loud. This is not just a story about death. It's a story about family pressure, about secrets hidden behind success, about how admiration can rot into resentment, and about how the truth doesn't always arrive all at once. It leaks out in pieces, sharp ones. Tonight, we begin at the very moment the world didn't know it was about to change. Because according to investigators, the clock stopped inside that house long before anyone realized something was wrong. And once you hear the first detail from the report, you'll understand why nothing about this case is simple. Let's rewind. For decades, Rob Reiner was untouchable, a director whose films defined generations. A man whose voice carried weight in political rooms, charity galas, and late-night talk shows. Someone people described as loud, opinionated, but ultimately harmless. The kind of man who felt permanent. Beside him was Michelle Singer Rayner, quieter, observant, always just a step out of the spotlight. A photographer by trade, a documentarian of moments. Friends said she noticed everything, but rarely said much. Together, they were presented as unshakable. 40-plus years of marriage. Children raised in privilege, but also expectation. A home in one of Los Angeles's most guarded neighborhoods. From the outside, it looked like stability. But here's the first uncomfortable question. How well do we ever really know what happens inside a house once the doors close? Because according to the fictional medical examiner's report that would later stun the public, whatever happened inside the Rayner home was not sudden. And it was not clean. Multiple sharp force injuries. Not one. Not two. Multiple. That single phrase would ignite weeks of speculation, outrage, and disbelief. Multiple means repetition. It means proximity. It means time. And it immediately destroyed the illusion that this was some tragic accident or break-in gone wrong. But the public didn't know that yet. At first, there was only confusion. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, their daughter, Romy, decided to check in. No answer to calls. No response to messages. This wasn't normal. Michelle always responded. Always. Neighbors would later say nothing seemed off. No broken windows. No alarms. No shouting earlier in the day. Just a house sitting too still. When authorities arrived, they reportedly knew within minutes that this wasn't natural. The scene told a story before anyone spoke. And what that story suggested would eventually lead investigators somewhere no one wanted to look. Inside the family. But even then, the most chilling details hadn't surfaced yet. Because the report wouldn't be released immediately. The cause of death wouldn't be announced right away. And the timeline. That would become a problem. When did it happen? Who was last to see them alive? Why did certain hours not line up? Early leaks suggested confusion among responders. Some believed the deaths occurred overnight. Others suspected early morning. But the final report would quietly list a date that contradicted public assumptions. Sunday. Not earlier. Not later. Sunday. Which raised a devastating question. If the deaths happened that day, then where was everyone else? And more importantly, who wasn't surprised? As the story broke, fans flooded social media with disbelief. Tributes poured in. Clips resurfaced of Rowan laughing on talk shows, shouting opinions, arguing politics. But something strange happened. One family member didn't speak. No statement. No tearful appearance. No public grief. Just absence. And absence, in cases like this, is never neutral. By the end of the day, police attention shifted. Not outward. Inward. Towards someone who had lived in the shadow of greatness his entire life. Someone who knew the house. The routines. The rhythms. Someone who, according to sources, had struggled quietly for years under expectations no one else could see. Their son, Nico Rayner. His arrest would come fast. Too fast, some said. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Use of a dangerous weapon. A knife. That detail alone would fracture the narrative. Because knives aren't distant. They aren't impersonal. They require closeness. They require emotion. They require intent or loss of control. When Nico appeared in court days later, reporters noted something unsettling. He didn't look defiant. He didn't look smug. He looked empty, shackled, wearing a suicide prevention vest, kept partially out of view. He spoke once. "Yes, Your Honor." That was it. No explanation. No outburst. No plea. And that silence would become louder than any confession. But here's where the story truly begins to twist. Because the medical examiner's report didn't just describe how they died. It hinted at how long this had been building. Wound patterns, defensive markings, positions of the bodies, details that suggested fear and recognition. As if, in their final moments, they knew exactly who was standing in front of them. Which raises a question that's almost unbearable to ask. What kind of conversation happens right before something like this? Was there shouting? Was there pleading? Was there an argument that crossed a line no one could uncross? Or was it quiet? Because sometimes, the most horrifying acts don't happen in rage. They happen in resignation. Over the next hour, we're going to unpack 13 disturbing details tied to this fictional case. Each one on its own is troubling. Together, they form a picture that is deeply unsettling. Details that expose cracks in the family image, contradictions in timelines, moments where help might have intervened, but didn't, and details that suggest this wasn't a single bad day. It was a slow burn. But before we get to the report itself, before we break down the injuries, the court appearance, and the evidence that changed everything, we need to go back further. Back to the family dynamics no one wanted to examine. Back to the pressure cooker that fame creates behind closed doors. Back to the signs that, in hindsight, were hiding in plain sight. Because if you only look at the ending, you miss the warning signs. And according to those closest to the Rainers, the warning signs were there long before the sirens arrived. But what came next, buried deep in the early investigation, would change how this story was understood forever. And once you hear it, you'll realize this case was never just about a crime. It was about everything that led up to it. No one ever described the Reiner house as peaceful. Beautiful, yes. Impressive, absolutely. But peaceful? Never. Even before what happened, people who stepped inside said there was always a strange energy lingering in the air. Like the walls were listening. Like conversations echoed longer than they should. This wasn't just a home. It was a monument. Trophies lined the shelves. Framed posters from legendary films covered the hallways. Photos with presidents, actors, activists, power brokers. Frozen smiles from different decades. Every corner whispered one message. This family mattered. And that message, according to those who knew them, weighed differently on each person inside. Especially the children. Here's the thing no one likes to admit about famous households. Success doesn't stop at the front door. It follows you inside. It watches you eat dinner. It sits across from you at the table. And in the Reiner home, success spoke loudly. Rowan Reiner was not a quiet man. Never had been. He filled rooms with his voice. With opinions. With certainty. Friends described him as passionate. Critics called him domineering. Family members used more careful language. He had a way of making you feel small without raising his voice. One fictional acquaintance would later say, like you were always being measured. Measured against what? Against legacy. Rowan didn't just want accomplished children. He wanted exceptional ones. And when expectation becomes identity, failure doesn't feel like disappointment. It feels like erasure. Michelle Singer-Reiner, on the other hand, played a different role. She watched. She documented. She remembered. While Rowan argued politics and art at the dinner table, Michelle noticed body language. Tone shifts. Who stopped talking when someone else entered the room. Some say she acted as a buffer between father and son. Others believe she unintentionally made things worse by smoothing over conflicts that needed to explode. Because unresolved tension doesn't disappear. It ferments. And by the time Nico Reiner reached adulthood, that fermentation had turned toxic. From the outside, Nico had every advantage. Private schools, industry connections, financial security. But advantage is only valuable if it aligns with who you are. And Nico, according to those close to him, never wanted the spotlight his last name dragged behind it. He wasn't rebellious in the dramatic sense. He didn't party excessively. He didn't court scandal. Instead, he withdrew. and withdrawal in a house like that is noticed. Rowan allegedly took it personally. Imagine growing up with a father whose name opens doors everywhere, except inside your own mind. Every achievement feels borrowed. Every failure feels amplified. You're not just disappointing a parent. You're disappointing an idea. And ideas don't forgive. As years passed, the relationship between Rowan and Nico reportedly oscillated between cold distance and sudden confrontation. Long stretches of silence. Then explosive arguments over things that seemed small on the surface. Money, career direction, responsibility. But beneath every argument sat the same unspoken question. Why aren't you more? Michelle often intervened. She'd changed the subject, one family friend recalled. She hated conflict, especially between them. But avoiding conflict doesn't resolve it. It just delays the impact. By the time Nico moved back into the family home, a detail that would later become crucial, tensions were already high. Why was he back? Some say financial struggles. Others point to mental health challenges. A few suggest something darker, a sense of being trapped between independence and dependence. Living under your parents' roof as an adult is complicated for anyone. Now add fame, add judgment, add decades of unresolved disappointment, and then add proximity. Because proximity is dangerous when resentment exists. The house itself amplified everything. Large rooms that echoed arguments. Hallways long enough for thoughts to spiral while pacing. Doors that closed but never quite shut out the noise. Neighbors would later say they occasionally heard raised voices. Nothing alarming. Nothing police-worthy. Just tension. The kind you assume every family has. But here's a detail that didn't surface until much later. According to investigators, there were no signs of forced entry on the day the bodies were found. No broken locks. No shattered glass. Which means whoever was there belonged there. And that immediately reframes every argument that happened in that house over the years. Because arguments aren't just words. They're rehearsals. Every unresolved fight leaves behind a script. By Sunday morning, the day everything collapsed, those scripts had been written over decades. Let's talk about that morning. Because nothing about it screamed tragedy at first. Michelle had plans. Rowan had unfinished projects. Messages were left unanswered, but not long enough to alarm anyone immediately. Time passed. Then Romy decided to check in. That decision, small as it seems, altered everything. But before she ever reached the house, something crucial had already happened inside it. Investigators later theorized that the confrontation didn't begin violently. It began verbally. A discussion, an argument, a breaking point. And here's where psychology matters. Violence between strangers often looks chaotic. Violence between family members often looks deliberate. The medical examiner's fictional report would later note wound placement that suggested closeness. Not frenzy, not random motion. Intent. And intent doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows. Which brings us back to Nico. Friends described him as quiet but intense. Thoughtful, but prone to rumination. The kind of person who replays conversations long after they've ended. That trait, combined with long-term emotional pressure, can be volatile, especially when paired with isolation. Because isolation convinces you that no one understands. And once someone believes that, drastic actions start to feel logical. The night before Sunday, neighbors reported nothing unusual. No screams, no disturbance, which suggests something chilling. Whatever happened likely occurred during the day, in daylight, when everything should feel normal. And that detail alone unsettled investigators. Because crimes committed in daylight often aren't impulsive. They're confrontational. They involve choices. The knife, later referenced in court, wasn't some exotic weapon. It was ordinary, the kind found in most kitchens. And that ordinariness makes the act harder to process. Because it strips away excuses. This wasn't a moment manufactured by circumstance. It was a moment enabled by familiarity, by access, by history. As detectives combed through the house, they reportedly found no signs of a struggle extending through multiple rooms. The incident appeared contained, localized, which suggests something else. Trust. People don't flee when they trust the person in front of them. They argue. They reason. They hesitate. And hesitation costs time. Time that, in this case, proved fatal. As the investigation unfolded, attention returned again and again to one question. Why now? Why this day? Why did something that simmered for decades erupt on a quiet Sunday? And that's when investigators began examining what happened in the weeks leading up to it. Financial conversations, legal discussions, potential changes to living arrangements. Details that hadn't seemed important before suddenly took on new weight. Because change threatens unstable equilibrium. And families like the Reiners survived on equilibrium. Appearances, routines, unspoken agreements. When those agreements fracture, reality rushes in. And reality doesn't negotiate. By the time Nico was taken into custody later that day, the house had already been transformed. From a symbol of success into a timeline. Every object became evidence. Every room told a version of the story. But the story was incomplete. Because evidence can show how something happened, but not always why. That why would come later. Piece by piece. Detail by horrifying detail. And the next detail investigators uncovered would raise a question so disturbing that even seasoned professionals paused. Because it suggested this wasn't just a breaking point. It was a moment that had been approaching for a very long time. But what they found next, hidden in plain sight, would shift the entire narrative. And once it surfaced, nothing about this case would feel accidental again. The first thing investigators learned to respect is time. Because time doesn't lie, people do. And in this case, time immediately became the problem. At first glance, the timeline seemed straightforward. A quiet Sunday, a concerned daughter, a welfare check, 2 bodies discovered inside a locked home. Simple. Too simple. Because when detectives began reconstructing the final hours inside the Reiner house, something refused to line up. Messages sent but never answered. Calls that rang longer than expected. Gaps where activity should have existed but didn't. And gaps are where truth hides. Let's start with the phones. Rowan's phone last pinged earlier than expected. Michelle's showed activity later than Rowan's, but still hours before Romy arrived. That alone raised eyebrows. If they were together, why weren't their devices silent at the same time? One theory suggested separate movements inside the house. Different rooms, different emotional states. Another theory was more unsettling, that one of them was alive longer than the other, which immediately reframed the nature of the crime. Because if that were true, then what followed wasn't a single act. It was a sequence. Investigators examined timestamps meticulously. Texts from colleagues went unread. Missed calls stacked quietly. Nothing outwardly alarming. Until you consider the family's habits. Michelle always responded. Rowan, even when busy, returned calls. Silence wasn't their norm. Silence was a signal. Then came the security system. No alarms were triggered. No forced entry detected. No emergency alerts sent. Which meant whoever was inside had access. Authorization. Belonging. That narrowed the field drastically. Next came the neighbors. One reported seeing a familiar car parked outside earlier than usual. Another mentioned someone leaving briefly, then returning. Neither detail seemed significant on its own. Together, they suggested movement. Someone coming and going. Which begged the question, why leave at all? Unless you're trying to clear your head. Or construct an alibi. Or delay discovery. When investigators asked Nico about his whereabouts, his answers were reportedly vague. Not evasive. Just thin. I was around. I don't remember exactly. I needed space. Space from what? That's where the timeline started to bend. Detectives overlaid phone data with vehicle movement, then layered in witness statements. What emerged wasn't a clean line. It was a staggered pattern. Appear, disappear, reappear. Almost like hesitation. Almost like someone pacing the edges of a decision they hadn't fully committed to yet. And that hesitation matters. Because hesitation means awareness. It means choice. One investigator would later say the timeline didn't look like someone snapping. It looked like someone circling. And circling implies intent. Then came the medical examiner's estimated time of death. Sunday. Not Saturday night. Not early Monday. Sunday. But not all at once. The report suggested a window, not a moment. Which meant the deaths didn't necessarily occur simultaneously. And that's when the most disturbing possibility surfaced. What if one of them survived long enough to understand what was happening? What if one tried to intervene? What if one tried to stop it? That question haunted investigators. Because the positioning of the bodies suggested movement, not collapse. Movement implies reaction. Reaction implies recognition. And recognition implies betrayal. The timeline also revealed something else. A delay. A long one. If the estimated time of death was hours before discovery, why hadn't anyone noticed sooner? Why hadn't Nico called for help? Why hadn't anyone reported an emergency? There were no frantic calls, no panic messages, just quiet. And quiet after violence is never accidental. It's chosen. Investigators began asking a darker question. Was the delay intentional? Delays can serve many purposes. Shock, denial, fear. But they can also serve strategy. Time allows you to think, to clean up, to rehearse what you'll say. The house didn't show signs of extensive cleanup. But that didn't rule out smaller acts. A wiped surface, a repositioned object, a door closed. Tiny changes that alter interpretation. One detective reportedly fixated on the kitchen. Because kitchens are communal spaces. Arguments start there. They escalate there. And the knife, the alleged weapon, came from there. Which means the confrontation didn't begin as a planned attack. It began as a conversation. Then something shifted. But here's the contradiction. If the argument escalated spontaneously, why the delay afterward? Why not call for help? Why not flee? Unless fleeing wasn't the goal. Unless control was. The timeline also revealed that Romy's decision to check in wasn't random. She hadn't heard back in hours. That worried her. Which implies this silence was noticeable even to family. Meaning someone knew silence would be noticed. And still did nothing. As detectives pressed deeper, they uncovered something chilling. A recent discussion about the future of the house. About living arrangements. About change. Change is destabilizing. Especially for someone already struggling with identity and belonging. What if Nico believed everything was about to shift? What if he felt cornered? Because cornered people don't always fight. Sometimes they calculate. The timeline showed no evidence of a struggle spilling outside the home, which suggests whatever happened felt contained, controlled. And control is often mistaken for calm. But calm can be deceptive. Sometimes it's just the absence of resistance. By the time Nico was arrested later that day, detectives believed the most important evidence wasn't physical. It was temporal, the order of events. Who knew what and when? Who had time to reconsider and didn't? Who could have stopped it and chose not to? And that's when investigators uncovered something that would become detail number 3. Something that didn't appear in the initial reports. Something subtle, but devastating. A gap where a call should have been made. A moment where help was possible, but wasn't sought. And that gap raised a question that would follow this case into court. Was this a crime of passion or a crime of opportunity? Because the difference matters. And once you see the timeline the way investigators saw it, the answer becomes terrifyingly clear. But the timeline wasn't the only thing that didn't add up. Because when the medical examiner finally released the injury details, they told a story time couldn't hide. And that story revealed something far worse than hesitation. It revealed escalation. And once we step into those details, there's no turning back. Because what came next would change how everyone understood the final moments inside that house. The human body remembers what the mind cannot say. That's the unspoken rule every medical examiner understands. Because when a crime scene goes quiet, when witnesses contradict themselves, when timelines blur, the body remains brutally honest. And in this case, the body's told a story no one was prepared to hear. When the fictional medical examiner's report was finally reviewed by investigators, the language was clinical, cold, precise, unemotional. But beneath those sterile words was something deeply unsettling. Multiple sharp force injuries. That phrase would later circulate through headlines, but few people truly understood what it meant. Because multiple doesn't just indicate quantity. It indicates repetition. Repetition requires time. It requires proximity. It requires the kind of emotional intensity that doesn't come from nowhere. This wasn't a single strike. It was a sequence. And sequences imply escalation. Investigators noted that the injuries were not identical between Rowan and Michelle. That difference mattered. Rowan's wounds were described as aggressive, focused, concentrated in areas associated with confrontation. Chest, upper torso, areas that suggest facing someone directly. Michelle's injuries, however, told a different story. Some were defensive, raised arms, hands, forearms. The kind of injuries that occur when someone realizes something has gone terribly wrong and instinctively tries to protect themselves. That single detail shattered the illusion that this was quick, or mutual, or instantaneous. It suggested realization. And realization is horrifying, because it means there was a moment when everything could still have stopped, but didn't. The report also suggested the injuries occurred in close quarters. No long-distance motion. No wide swings. This wasn't rage flailing blindly. It was controlled movement. Deliberate placement. Which raised an uncomfortable possibility. That whoever inflicted these injuries knew exactly where they were standing. Knew exactly how close they were. And knew exactly who they were facing. Family violence is different from stranger violence. Stranger violence often carries uncertainty. Family violence carries memory. Every strike echoes past conversations, past arguments, past resentments. And that emotional layering often manifests in how injuries appear. Investigators noticed something else. The injuries didn't suggest surprise from both victims at the same time, which meant one may have been targeted first. And once one fell, the dynamic changed. That possibility haunted detectives, because it introduces sequence again. First one, then the other. And once that sequence starts, the chance to stop it narrows rapidly. The kitchen became central to this theory. Blood spatter analysis suggested the initial confrontation began there. Not in a bedroom, not in a hallway, a shared space, which implies conversation. The knife, an ordinary kitchen knife, was not carried into the room. It was already there, which supports the idea that the moment escalated suddenly. But sudden doesn't mean unpredictable, especially when resentment has been building for years. Michelle's defensive wounds suggested she attempted to intervene, to shield, to de-escalate. That aligns with what friends had always said about her role in the family. The mediator, the buffer, the one who stepped between. But buffers absorb impact, and eventually, they fail. The report also noted something subtle, but devastating. The injuries were not all delivered with the same force. Some were shallow, some were deep. That variation implies hesitation, or escalation, or both. Hesitation at first, then resolve, which raises a chilling question. What thought crossed the attacker's mind between the first injury and the last? Because once you cross a line, you either stop, or you commit fully. There is no middle ground. The medical examiner could not determine exact timing between each injury, but the pattern suggested moments, not milliseconds, between actions. Enough time to process, enough time to reconsider, enough time to stop. And that detail would later become a focal point for prosecutors. Because crimes of passion are chaotic. This wasn't chaos. This was progression. Another detail quietly included in the report was the absence of substances. No alcohol, no drugs, which eliminated one common explanation. This wasn't intoxication. It wasn't impaired judgment. It was a clear mind acting under emotional strain. And that makes everything more disturbing, because it means this wasn't about losing control. It was about choosing an outcome. Investigators also noted the lack of extensive injuries to the attacker. No deep cuts, no significant defensive wounds, which suggested the victims were not armed. They were not fighting back in equal measure. They were reacting. That imbalance matters. It speaks to power dynamics, to surprise, to dominance. The final detail in the report stopped everyone cold. The cause of death was listed as homicide, not accident, not manslaughter, not undetermined. Homicide, intentional, and that classification carries weight, because medical examiners do not use it lightly. They rely on patterns, consistency, evidence that aligns too cleanly to ignore. Once that word was attached, the case shifted. Public sympathy fractured, speculation intensified, and the narrative hardened. But here's the part that rarely makes headlines. Medical reports don't explain motivation. They don't explain why someone crossed a line they can never uncross. For that, investigators had to dig into something far less tangible, the mind, and specifically Nico's, because as damning as the injuries were, they still didn't explain why that day became the breaking point. What changed? What snapped? What pushed years of tension into irreversible action? The answer wouldn't be found in blood patterns or wound measurements. It would be found in something far quieter, something that had been building unnoticed. Something that would soon surface in court documents and private communications. And once it did, it reframed the injuries not as the beginning of the story, but as the inevitable end of something far older. Because the next detail investigators uncovered wasn't about the bodies. It was about what Nico believed was about to be taken from him. And that belief would make everything else make sense. Motive is the most dangerous word in any investigation. Because once you find it, the crime stops being abstract. It becomes human. And in this case, the motive wasn't hidden in some dramatic manifesto or angry outburst. It was buried in conversations that sounded ordinary. So ordinary that no one thought to listen closely at the time. Investigators began pulling apart the weeks leading up to that Sunday. Not just days, weeks, phone records, emails, calendar entries. And slowly, a theme emerged. Change. There were discussions happening behind closed doors. About money. About independence. About the future. Specifically, about Nico's place in it. For years, Nico had existed in a fragile balance. Supported, but scrutinized. Protected, but pressured. Living in the family home was not meant to be permanent. It was supposed to be transitional. A pause. But pauses become permanent when no one knows how to move forward. Rowan had grown increasingly vocal about next steps. Friends described him as frustrated. Not angry. Disappointed. And disappointment cuts deeper than anger. Disappointment implies expectation. And expectation, unmet, becomes resentment on both sides. Michelle reportedly tried to soften these conversations. She suggested patience, therapy, gradual change. But Rowan believed enabling was harming. Two philosophies colliding under one roof. That collision mattered, because Nico was caught in the middle. According to fictional sources close to the family, Nico had recently been told that changes were coming. Not suggestions, decisions. Living arrangements would be reassessed. Financial support would be restructured. Independence would no longer be optional. To an outsider, that sounds reasonable. But to someone already struggling with identity, stability, and belonging, it can feel like abandonment. And abandonment triggers fear. Fear triggers survival instincts. Investigators found that Nico had asked several questions in the days before the incident. About timelines. About alternatives. About what would happen if he couldn't meet expectations immediately. Those questions weren't met with reassurance. They were met with firmness. Boundaries. Rowan believed boundaries were love. Nico experienced them as rejection. That disconnect is critical, because motive doesn't live in facts. It lives in perception. And Nico's perception, according to those who knew him, was narrowing. He believed the ground beneath him was shifting, that the one place he felt anchored was about to disappear. And when people feel cornered, they don't think in long arcs. They think in moments. Investigators also uncovered evidence of escalating arguments. Not constant shouting, but sharper exchanges. More final language. Words like "can't keep doing this" and "something has to change." Language that signals an ending. And endings are dangerous when someone isn't ready to let go. Michelle's role in these conversations became a point of interest. She was often present, often mediating, often attempting to reframe. But mediation can backfire, because it can feel like both sides are against you. One pushing, one managing, neither truly hearing. On the morning of the incident, it's believed another conversation took place. Not dramatic, not explosive at first, just another attempt to address the future. But this time, something landed differently. Maybe it was the finality. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the realization that negotiation was over. At some point, the conversation stopped being about logistics and started being about worth. And worth is existential. When someone feels their worth is being measured and found lacking, rational thought collapses. The motive, investigators believed, wasn't money. It wasn't inheritance. It wasn't greed. It was fear of erasure. Fear of being cut loose. Fear of becoming nothing once the safety net was gone. That fear doesn't excuse anything, but it explains escalation. And escalation is what the injuries reflected. Once the idea took hold that everything was about to change irrevocably, Nico's internal narrative hardened. He wasn't being guided. He was being pushed. And pushed people either move or push back violently. What makes this motive so disturbing is its banality. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about hate. It was about control over an uncertain future. And control, once lost, can feel worth reclaiming at any cost. Investigators also noted something else. Nico had been isolating more in the days before, withdrawing from friends, avoiding calls. Isolation intensifies internal narratives. There's no external correction. No one to say, "This isn't the end." By the time Sunday arrived, Nico was emotionally alone inside a house full of people. That paradox is lethal, because loneliness in proximity feels like betrayal. The motive crystallized not as a plan, but as a belief. A belief that if things continued, he would lose everything. And when someone believes they have nothing to lose, they become dangerous. But motive alone doesn't convict. Investigators needed behavior, actions that aligned with intent. And that's when they turned to Nico's behavior after the incident. Not what he said, what he didn't do. And what he didn't do would become one of the most damning aspects of the case, because it suggested not shock, but acceptance. And once that behavior was examined closely, the narrative shifted again, from tragic escalation to something far more calculated. Because the next detail investigators uncovered wasn't about fear. It was about what Nico did once the damage was done. And that detail would change how prosecutors framed everything. There is a moment after every irreversible act. A pause. A space where reality rushes in and the mind has to decide what comes next. That moment is where truth often lives. And in this case, that moment was defined by silence. No scream. No call for help. No frantic rush into the street. Just quiet. Investigators would later say the most unsettling part of this case wasn't the violence. It was what followed it. Because after the final injury, time didn't stop. It stretched. Minutes passed. Then more. And during that time, choices were made. Or deliberately not made. Nico didn't collapse into hysteria. He didn't flee the scene immediately. He didn't attempt first aid. According to the reconstructed timeline, he stayed. And staying is a decision. Phones were nearby. Emergency services were reachable. But no call went out. That absence would become central to the prosecution's narrative. Because panic seeks help. Shock seeks help. Silence seeks control. Investigators examined Nico's movements after the incident. Not dramatic movements. Ordinary ones. A door opened. Another closed. A pause in the kitchen. A walk down the hallway. These were not the actions of someone detached from reality. They were the actions of someone processing. And processing means awareness. The house itself bore subtle signs of this period. Not cleanup. Not staging. But normalization. A chair moved back into place. An object set down neatly. Small acts that suggest an attempt to restore order. As if order could undo what had already happened. One detective described it as tidying around a catastrophe. That phrase stuck, because it captured something deeply human and deeply unsettling. The desire to make the world look normal when nothing is. Neighbors later reported seeing Nico leave the house briefly. Not running. Not panicked. Walking. That detail raised immediate concern. Because people in shock don't walk calmly. They freeze. They spiral. Or they break. Walking implies intention. Purpose. He returned later. Again, no emergency call. No attempt to alert anyone. Just waiting. Waiting for what? Investigators believe Nico knew discovery was inevitable. He wasn't trying to escape. He was delaying. And delay can serve many purposes. Time to think. Time to accept. Time to prepare. Psychologists often note that acceptance doesn't always look like grief. Sometimes it looks like stillness. By the time Romy arrived, the silence had solidified. She walked into a house that no longer functioned as a home. And what she found would haunt her forever. But what matters for the investigation is what happened before that discovery. Because Nico had hours. Hours where intervention was possible. Hours where remorse could have translated into action. But it didn't. And that gap between act and discovery became one of the most powerful pieces of circumstantial evidence. The defense would later argue dissociation, shock-induced paralysis. But prosecutors saw something else. Containment. A conscious choice to do nothing. And doing nothing, in this context, is not neutral. It's active. The silence also extended beyond the house. Nico didn't reach out to friends. Didn't message anyone for help. Didn't attempt to explain. He withdrew completely. Isolation again. But this time, isolation after violence carries a different weight. It suggests an internal resolution, as if the conflict had ended, regardless of the cost. When police finally arrived, Nico's demeanor reportedly surprised them. He wasn't hysterical. He wasn't aggressive. He was flat, cooperative, quiet, almost resigned. That demeanor would later be debated endlessly. Was it shock? Or was it acceptance? Investigators noted no immediate denial. No insistence on innocence. No alternative explanation offered. just compliance. And compliance can be interpreted in many ways. But combined with the silence that preceded it, it painted a troubling picture. Because people who believe something was justified often don't argue. They believe the outcome speaks for itself. As the house filled with officers, technicians, and cameras, the silence finally broke. But not from Nico. From the reality of what had been done. And once that reality entered the public sphere, the narrative exploded. But there was one more layer to the silence. One that wouldn't become apparent until court. Because Nico's silence didn't end with his arrest. It continued. In the interrogation room. In holding. In court. He spoke only when required. And when he did, it was minimal. Yes, Your Honor. That restraint wasn't accidental. It was consistent. Which raised a final, haunting question. What was going through his mind during those hours of silence? Was it regret? Was it numbness? Or was it something far colder? Because sometimes silence isn't the absence of emotion. It's the presence of a conclusion. And that conclusion, once reached, doesn't unravel easily. The next chapter in this story wouldn't unfold in the house. It would unfold under fluorescent lights. In a courtroom, where silence takes on a different meaning, and where every pause is interpreted. Because what Nico didn't say in court would become just as important as what he did. And once the courtroom doors closed, the story entered a new phase. One where every detail would be dissected, and one where the illusion of privacy would finally collapse. Because what happened next wasn't about family anymore. It was about judgment, and that judgment was just beginning. Courtrooms are designed to feel neutral. Same colors, same rituals, same language. But neutrality disappears the moment the accused walks in. And when Rob Reiner entered the courtroom for the first time, the air changed. Reporters had already filled the benches. Legal observers leaned forward. Everyone waited for something, an expression, a reaction, a crack. They didn't get one. Nico was brought in quietly, shackled, wearing a suicide prevention vest. That detail alone sent a jolt through the room. Because a vest like that doesn't appear unless someone, somewhere, believes the risk is real. It suggested fragility, or danger, or both. He was kept partially hidden from view at first, as if the court itself wasn't sure how much of him the world should see. And when he finally came fully into view, something became immediately clear. This wasn't the face of someone preparing to fight. It was the face of someone who had already accepted an outcome. His posture was still, his eyes unfocused. Not vacant, but distant, as if he were watching events happen from far away. The judge began with formalities, rights, procedures, next steps. And when Nico was asked if he understood his right to a speedy trial, he answered, "Yes, Your Honor." 2 words. No tremor. No hesitation. That was it. That moment became iconic. Clipped. Shared. Analyzed endlessly. People projected meaning onto it. Some saw guilt. Others saw shock. A few saw manipulation. But what mattered to investigators wasn't how it looked. It was how it fit the pattern. Because Nico's behavior in court matched his behavior after the incident. Minimal. Contained. Controlled. The prosecution took note. So did the defense. Because demeanor matters. Juries notice it. Judges notice it. And in cases like this, every gesture becomes evidence. The charges were read aloud. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Use of a dangerous weapon. The words echoed in the room. First degree. That classification wasn't chosen lightly. It implied intent, premeditation, deliberation. And as those words landed, Nico didn't react. No flinch. No protest. Just stillness. Which raised an unsettling possibility. That he had already rehearsed this moment. That he had imagined it. Because people who are blindsided often react visibly. People who expect something often don't. The courtroom itself seemed to absorb that stillness. Even seasoned reporters later said it felt different. Heavier. As if everyone sensed they were watching the aftermath of something deeply personal. The judge set dates. An arraignment hearing. Procedural steps. And throughout it all, Nico remained silent. The defense requested no plea be entered yet. Strategic. Careful. They needed time. Because this case wasn't just about facts. It was about narrative. And narrative takes shaping. Outside the courtroom, speculation exploded. Was he mentally unstable? Was this a psychotic break? Was it calculated? The suicide prevention vest fueled rumors. Some claimed it proved remorse. Others argued it indicated manipulation. Mental health would quickly become a battleground. But what few people noticed was what didn't happen. Nico didn't look to the gallery, didn't search for familiar faces, didn't react to whispers or cameras. He behaved as if the room didn't exist, which psychologists later said could indicate dissociation, or emotional shutdown, or something else entirely. The prosecution, however, focused on consistency. Consistency in silence. Consistency in behavior. From the house, to custody, to court. That consistency undermined claims of temporary loss of control. Because temporary loss fades, patterns persist. And this was a pattern. After the hearing, Nico was escorted out without incident. Still quiet, still contained. And as the courtroom emptied, one question lingered. What defense could possibly explain all of this? Because the injuries suggested escalation. The timeline suggested deliberation. The silence suggested acceptance. That's a hard triangle to break. But the defense wasn't planning to break it head-on. They were planning to reframe it. And that reframing would begin with something that hadn't yet been discussed publicly. Nico's mental state long before that Sunday. Records, therapists, medications. A history that, once revealed, would complicate everything. Because the next chapter of this story wouldn't be about what happened that day. It would be about what had been happening for years. And once that history came into focus, the question of responsibility would become far less straightforward. Because the line between explanation and excuse is thin, and both sides were about to walk it. But before any of that could happen, the court scheduled the next hearing. January. Time. And time, as this case had already proven, changes everything. Every trial like this eventually turns inward, away from the blood, away from the timelines, away from the house, and toward the mind. Because once the physical evidence is laid bare, the only question left is why a person became capable of crossing a line they once would have sworn they never could. For the defense, that question wasn't optional. It was survival. If they couldn't dismantle the facts, they had to reframe the person. And that reframing began long before Sunday. Long before the knife. Long before the silence. It began with Nico's history. Not the public one. The private one. The defense team quietly started building a psychological profile that stretched back years. Therapy records. School evaluations. Medical notes. Nothing dramatic on its own. But together, they formed a pattern. Anxiety. Depression. Episodes of dissociation. Periods where Nico reportedly struggled to feel grounded in his own life. Friends had noticed it, even if they didn't have language for it at the time. He'd disappear emotionally, one acquaintance said. Like he was there, but not really there. That kind of description doesn't alarm people when there's no violence attached. It becomes alarming only in hindsight. According to fictional sources, Nico had been in and out of therapy since his late teens. Not continuously, not consistently. More like someone reaching for help, then pulling away, which is common. Because therapy requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is dangerous in families built on expectation. Rowan, by most accounts, supported therapy in principle. But he believed resilience came from action, from pushing through, from discipline. To him, struggle was something you overcame, not something you sat with. Michelle understood Nico differently. She worried about him. She encouraged treatment. She advocated for patience. And that difference in parental approach created another fault line. Nico was receiving mixed messages. One parent urging understanding, the other urging strength, both believing they were helping. But for someone already struggling internally, that split can feel like confusion. As the defense prepared their strategy, they focused on one critical idea. That Nico didn't plan to kill anyone. That what happened was the result of a psychological collapse under pressure. A moment where rational thought shut down. They would argue diminished capacity, not innocence, but impairment. And to do that, they needed to show that Sunday wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of an internal breakdown. They began with Nico's recent behavior. Withdrawal, insomnia, heightened anxiety, signs that something was escalating internally. They also pointed to stressors that converged at once. The discussions about moving out, financial uncertainty, perceived loss of support. For someone with a fragile sense of self, those stressors can feel catastrophic. Not because they are objectively catastrophic, but because they trigger deeper fears. Fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear of being unlovable once usefulness ends. The defense also emphasized Nico's isolation. He wasn't leaning on friends. He wasn't seeking outside support. He was spiraling inward. And inward spirals distort reality. Small problems become existential threats. Ordinary conversations feel like ultimatums. Criticism feels like annihilation. That distortion would become central to the defense narrative. They weren't saying Nico wanted to kill his parents. They were saying Nico believed he was about to lose everything and couldn't process it. But prosecutors weren't convinced. They acknowledged the mental health history. But they saw something else. Function. Nico functioned after the act. He walked. He waited. He complied. That level of functioning suggested presence of mind. And presence of mind undermines claims of total dissociation. This became the core tension. Impairment versus intent. Was Nico acting in a fog? Or was he acting with awareness? Psychiatric experts would later debate this endlessly. Some argued dissociation can coexist with functional behavior. Others insisted that the level of control displayed post-incident suggested clarity. The mind, after all, is not binary. People can be emotionally overwhelmed and still capable of choice. That gray area is where trials live, and where juries struggle. As more details emerged, the defense also highlighted something else. There was no history of violence, no prior threats, no restraining orders, no documented aggressive behavior. This wasn't someone known for volatility, which made the act itself harder to reconcile. But prosecutors flipped that argument. They suggested the absence of prior violence made the act more deliberate, not less. Because sudden violence in someone without a history often indicates a singular, meaningful trigger, not randomness, not chaos, a specific breaking point. And they believed that breaking point was the confrontation about change. The defense countered with another angle. That Nico's identity was fused with the family. That separation felt like annihilation. That annihilation triggered a primal response. Not to harm, but to stop the perceived threat. The problem, of course, is that stopping the threat required violence. And violence has consequences. As expert evaluations were ordered, the public waited. Psychiatric reports are slow, detailed, methodical. They require interviews, testing, observation. And while those evaluations were underway, speculation filled the silence. Was Nico mentally ill? Was he manipulative? Was he both? Mental illness narratives are uncomfortable. They force us to confront the limits of control. They blur accountability. And they challenge our need for clear villains. But this case refused to be simple. Because even if Nico was impaired, even if his perception was distorted, two people were dead. And no diagnosis could change that. As weeks passed, the defense prepared to introduce expert testimony. Psychologists who would explain dissociation, who would describe how extreme stress can fracture perception, who would argue that in that moment, Nico's actions weren't guided by intent, but by panic and cognitive collapse. The prosecution prepared their rebuttal. Experts who would emphasize choice, who would highlight the pauses between actions, who would point to the silence afterward as evidence of awareness. This battle of minds would become the heart of the trial. Not blood evidence, not weapon analysis, but interpretation. How much agency did Nico have? And how much agency is required to be guilty of first-degree murder? That question doesn't have an easy answer. And it's one society wrestles with every time mental health enters a courtroom. But before any expert could take the stand, something else happened. Something unexpected. A detail from the past resurfaced. Not from Nico's records, but from Michelle's. A journal entry. A note. A private concern. Something that suggested she had been afraid. Not of Nico, but for him. And once that detail entered the conversation, the entire emotional landscape shifted. Because it hinted that Michelle may have seen something coming. And if she did, why wasn't more done? Why wasn't help forced? Why was everyone waiting? The answer to those questions wouldn't absolve anyone, but it would complicate everything. And it would lead directly into the next revelation. Because what Michelle had written, quietly, privately, would change how the final confrontation was understood. And once it was revealed, the story would no longer be just about Nico's mind. It would be about the family's collective failure to intervene. Warning signs rarely announce themselves with neon lights. They whisper. They linger in small moments. They appear in ways people convince themselves are normal. And in the Reiner household, the warning signs were there, subtle, persistent, and tragically ignored. Friends and family recall moments that seemed innocuous at the time. Nico retreating to his room for days, skipping family meals, checking out of conversations mid-sentence, losing himself in screens or books, hours passing unnoticed. To outsiders, these behaviors could have been described as introverted tendencies, mature reflection, or simply personal space. But those close to him knew differently. They noticed the tension building in his posture, the way his gaze could flicker with anxiety, frustration, or silent fury. It wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational, but it was there. And parents often rationalize quiet withdrawal as a phase. Rowan, busy with his career and legacy, may have written off Nico's behavior as immaturity or stubbornness. Michelle, ever observant, attempted intervention, yet she relied on mediation rather than enforcement. This pattern of small neglect, of subtle oversight, became a key element for investigators, because cumulative neglect often magnifies psychological pressure. Isolation combined with perceived judgment creates fertile ground for distorted thinking. Investigators collected anecdotal evidence, emails, texts, conversations with friends. A pattern emerged: repeated expressions of anxiety, feelings of being overwhelmed, and a longing for autonomy that conflicted with family expectations. Even small disputes over chores, responsibilities, or minor financial matters often escalated internally for Nico. While the family viewed these as minor annoyances, to him they represented ongoing criticism and loss of control. And control, as many psychologists will attest, is a primal human need. When control is threatened, especially in a household built on high expectations, reactions can become unpredictable. One former classmate noted that Nico often appeared tense before family events. He would rehearse conversations in his head, pace, or withdraw entirely. It was like he was expecting a storm every time he walked through the door, they said. The same pattern reportedly manifested in the days leading up to the incident. Investigators later reconstructed events and discovered small but consistent triggers: discussions about living arrangements, casual disagreements about schedules, and repeated reminders about responsibilities. These events, while mundane on the surface, carried psychological weight. But the family dynamic compounded the pressure. Rowan's high expectations, Michelle's attempts at mediation, and Nico's self-perception created a feedback loop. Every minor critique reinforced Nico's internal narrative. He was failing, trapped, and losing control of the only space that felt safe. And yet, for all the signs, intervention never occurred. Why not? Michelle, aware of the growing strain, reportedly worried about confrontation. She feared exacerbating tensions. Rowan believed in resilience and self-correction. Friends outside the household often saw only glimpses, unable to gauge the intensity of the underlying issues. The combination of isolation, high expectations, and perceived judgment set the stage for escalation. Investigators also examined small incidents that, in hindsight, appeared to foreshadow the tragedy. An argument over a mislaid item, a sharp retort during a dinner, a slammed door. Each incident alone seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern of rising tension, emotional suppression, and unresolved frustration. Even Nico's social withdrawal contributed to the warning signs. His increasing distance from peers meant there were fewer opportunities for corrective intervention. Without outside perspective, internalized stress magnifies and rational thinking begins to fray. Investigators concluded that the signs were clear if someone had been paying attention. But in high-achieving households, quiet suffering is often misread as normal behavior or independence. And that misinterpretation can have devastating consequences. What's haunting in this case is not only that warning signs were present, but that the ones closest to him, the parents, were unable or unwilling to act decisively. The tension, subtle and invisible to most, finally erupted in the only way it could, and the escalation wasn't abrupt. It was the culmination of decades of unaddressed stress, miscommunication, and unmet emotional needs. By the time investigators finished mapping these signs, the narrative was clear. There were moments when intervention could have changed everything. But those moments passed unnoticed. And the tragedy that followed was, in many ways, predictable. But even predictability didn't prepare anyone for the actual events that unfolded that Sunday morning. Because the next detail investigators uncovered wasn't about psychology or warning signs. It was about the actions that immediately triggered the violence, a turning point that, once identified, would shock even seasoned investigators.